Hello, and welcome to the Boffin Buzz, the podcast for anyone fascinated by farming's future. Hello, everyone, and welcome again to another episode of the Boffin Buzz. And just to remind everyone who does not know at the moment, we offer CPD points for the Boffin Buzz, and to get your CPD points, there will be details towards the end of this podcast. So I'm delighted this week to introduce Liz Bowles, who is joining us today. Hello, Liz.
Hello, Tom. It's lovely to be here.
Great, and it's lovely to see you here as well. Liz is CEO of the Farm Carbon Toolkit, one of our partners in the NCS project. So NCS, that's the Nitrogen Climate Smart project, which is a farmer-led research program involving 17 industry and research partners and over 200 farmers. So, and of course, the aims of that project, as regular listeners of the Boffin Buzz will know, is to help agriculture reduce its carbon emissions through increasing pulse cropping in arable rotations and replacing imported soya with UK grown pulses. So, welcome, Liz. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you. Yeah, I've been enjoying the lovely weather last week, but we're back to rain now in the southwest of England. So, yeah.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Well, could I just sort of first start by asking you to sort of introduce yourself? I mean, we've known each other for many years and many various guises, but could I just ask you to just give a bit of a background about yourself for our listeners?
Absolutely. So I'd start by saying that I'm very much a farmer at heart. I come from a farming family in the southwest of England. And I've been working in agriculture all my career. And I think it's probably fair to say I'm definitely a jack of all trades. And I think probably what's been most formative to me through my career is firstly to work for ADAS for just about 20 years in a number of different roles. And then I worked at the English Food and Farming Partnerships as the Southwest Project Manager, which actually was a brilliant job in helping me to understand a lot more about supply chains and also about how to help different groups of people to work together. And I've certainly been using that ever since. And then a stint at the Soil Association as their Associate Director of Farming and Land Use. Really, I think my role there was to work with all farmers, whether organic or not. And I think certainly over the period of time that I was there, I'm really sort of proud of the fact that the gap, I think, between organic farmers and other farmers did get narrower, which was brilliant.
Yeah.
And I think all of that sort of led me towards working at the Farm Carbon Toolkit as their first chief exec. I started working with Farm Carbon Toolkit in June 2022. Although I had been a director there, I was invited onto the board by Adam Twine, one of the founders of the toolkit, back in 2017. In fact, I'd known Adam since 1984 when we formed the Farmers World Network together. So, you know, I think my sort of involvement with agriculture is pretty broad, really. I'm now a sheep farmer down in Devon. I'm also a council member of the Shropshire Sheep Breeders Association. So yes, which is great because I think I understand quite a lot of all the issues facing farmers, as well as working at the Farm Carbon Toolkit.
Yes, absolutely. Well, I mean, I suppose we've come across each other most when you were at the Soil Association, and it's one thing that I've noticed about the Soil Association too. Especially with things like the innovative farmers, which is such a fantastic thing. And many of our members are also, involved in innovative farmers projects and the field labs. The work that we do at Boffin is very closely aligned with the work that innovative farmers are doing. And you're right; it has brought, that aspect in particular, in my mind, has brought conventional farmers and organic farmers much closer together. And we've got a lot of farmers. We've got organic farmers doing some of our trials, as well as conventional farmers. But there's a huge body of regen farmers, and I suppose that sort of sits in the middle. I don't know.
I think it straddles. I think it straddles.
Yeah.
That would be my
Exactly.
understanding of it, really. That you've got organic farmers who are regenerative, you've got non-organic farmers who are regenerative, and and in my mind, that it doesn't really matter what you call what you're doing. It's about actually what you're doing, and I
Mm.
think that the difference is that you are trying to find ways to farm with nature rather than against it.
Exactly. I mean, I suppose one of the things that the industry grapples with, I feel, is this definition of what is regenerative
Mm.
agriculture. And to my mind, regenerative agriculture is a journey that farmers are on. And if you're on a journey, everyone's perception of that journey is different. Really, it depends on who you are. The important thing is that you've got a direction. You're heading in a particular direction. You've got a goal in mind, but that is very personal to you. I mean, how you then turn that into an on-farm standard, I think is a really difficult one, and it's one that the industry, I think, grapples with.
Well, I think
Um,
most people have agreed that we don't necessarily want to create and ossify a standard for regen farming at the
yeah.
moment, because I think to do that immediately brings with it costs of how are you going to meet those standards and how are you going to evidence that you've met them, which I think is perhaps not something that we'd want to be doing at the moment. Certainly
Well,
not if it risked reducing the rate of uptake.
That's interesting that you say that, Liz, because as you say, you're CEO of the Farm Carbon Toolkit, and the whole point of the Farm Carbon Toolkit is, about measuring
It's about
um,
measuring,
that
yes.
that carbon journey. So, do you want to just give us a little bit of an overview of the Farm Carbon Toolkit's
Yeah,
mission and how you support farmers?
absolutely, be delighted to. So the Farm Carbon Toolkit was set up back in 2009, and it was set up by farmers for farmers as a community interest company. And the whole point of setting the organisation up was to help farmers to understand where their business greenhouse gas emissions were coming from, and how they could both reduce those emissions and remove carbon into soils, trees, and hedges. So that was the mission that we started from, and I would say that still remains our mission today. Um, I think the organisation itself has evolved massively from those days back in the 2010-11, because at that time there was very little interest from anywhere in anything to do with carbon footprinting. That there was some interest in more, I would say, more environmental organisations in the climate impact of agriculture, but
Mm,
certainly not in farmers measuring their footprint. And in fact, the carbon toolkits operation really only started to accelerate in about 2018, when suddenly farmers became more interested in wanting to know what their footprint looked like. And I think for many farmers, that was in response to the fact that they were being told that they were the problem, they were the cause of climate change. So we did start to see more and more farmers going onto our free calculator online just to
mm.
see what their footprint looked like. And from then on, I would say that the interest in the Carbon Toolkit and in our calculator has been on an ever accelerating trajectory. So that to the extent now that our organisation, we employ 20 people, which is double the number we employed 2 years ago when I joined the organisation, and that shows no sign of slowing down. And that's all in response to people coming to us asking us to do things. But what
Yeah.
we're doing is evolving over time. So we were lucky enough to be funded by Innovate a few years ago, and that's enabled us to create an API, which now means that we can integrate with other data sources and other data platforms, which I think will really accelerate the use of calculators by farmers.
Oh, well,
And
I'm glad you brought that up, Liz, because it was one thing that I was going to ask you about, because we have heard about this sort of collaboration between the carbon,
mhm,
the main carbon toolkits, and it is a thing that all farmers are going through at the moment. As you say, a lot of farmers want to know what their
mm.
carbon footprint is, but the question is, which one do you go for? And we hear so much about, will you put your your figures through this one and it gives you this result, and you put it through that one, it gives you a totally different. Which do you believe, and so on. So but you say you've got an Innovate grant for an API. What could you just explain a little bit more about what that
Well,
means?
basically, it's the ability to move data around much more easily. And in fact, that project finished about 9 months ago. But its legacy is that we have an API and are able to do that integration. But moving on to your main question about the harmonisation between three calculators and
Yes.
what should farmers do. Um, so the three calculators ourselves, Agriculc, which was incubated out of SRUC in Scotland, and the Cool Farm tool, which is owned by the Cool Farm Alliance. All three calculators we are quite commonly used across the UK and beyond. All three of us have got transparent methodologies. In other words, we publish how we do our calculations, so anybody can have a look and see how we do it. We all started talking, I would say, where are we now? Probably about 12 months ago now, because we were concerned that farmers, as you say, Tom, were saying, well, which calculator do I use? I'll get a different number, therefore they're all useless. And that isn't true, but we wanted to kind of dispel those myths by harmonizing our methodologies where we can. So that's essentially what we are now doing. We will not merge, and the reason for that being that each of the calculators was set up for different reasons to answer different questions. And actually, I think it wouldn't do the industry any good for there to be only one sort of viable option, if you like.
Yeah.
So that's why we are choosing to remain distinct calculators, but at the same time, where we can join forces and harmonize our methodologies, we will be doing that, because it will over time reduce some of those differences that users will see. But alongside that, we're also doing a piece which will just make it much clearer why the answers are different, and that there's nothing to worry about in those answers being different. So as
I
a
see.
farmer or grower, I think my advice is to find a calculator with a transparent methodology, i.e. you need to better see how they do it, and they should have that on their website. And then you choose the one that you like for whatever reason. It's either its usability or whatever it may be, but then that you stick to it, because the worst of all worlds would be to use one calculator one year and a different calculator another year, because then you won't necessarily know whether you've made any progress.
Okay, so for those people who are new to carbon calculators and they're doing it for the first time, why would they choose the Farm Carbon Toolkit as opposed to the other ones? I mean, you said just a minute ago that you will remain separate because they each do a separate job. So give us an idea of the sort of farmer who would be best to turn to the Farm Carbon Toolkit as opposed to the other ones.
Okay, I think the major difference is that we produce a whole farm carbon footprint. So we'll look at both the emissions and the sequestration on a farm level basis. So once you put all your data into our calculator, you will end up with a figure for your business's emissions. And that will be against all the different inputs and livestock emissions, manure emissions, etc., and split down into the three different greenhouse gases and different tiers. And then you'll also have a picture of your sequestration, and that sequestration will be based on data that you have entered in terms of the length, height and width of hedges, the age and number and type of trees you've got, and if you have any soil data, you need to input data, two sets of data at least a year apart, and then the calculation engine will calculate the change in carbon storage over that period and allocate a carbon removal number to that soil organic matter change.
Yeah, now, as far as I'm aware, that's one of the aspects, the soil aspect is one of the aspects that the Farm Carbon Toolkit does that few other carbon calculators do. And I think the SRUC Agriculc one doesn't take account of the soil sequestration. Am I
Not in
correct
the
there?
same way, but primarily it's a tool for looking at emissions per
Yeah.
ton of product, and that's the difference really, is that some calculators will focus on product emissions. We look at the whole farm, and
Right.
that's really what I'm saying, that neither are wrong. And I think that's the point really. And I think,
Hmm.
when the ADAS advisor did the work for DEFRA, looking at the 5 major calculators, I think he made the point very, very well, that, that there's many different ways to get it wrong, but there's no one way to get it right.
And for those people who have done, let's say, for example, you've done your carbon baselining with the Farm Carbon Toolkit, and then your supplier, your customer or whatever, is asking you, can you give us your carbon footprint, but we'd like you to do the Cool Farm tool,
Yeah.
for example. And I think a lot of us get those requests. And in fact, we're going to be talking in a bit about the NCS project, in which we're asking farmers to do the Farm Carbon Toolkit, and some of them may have done Cool Farm Tool or SRUC Agricult before. So, I mean, my impression is that once you've brought all your data together and you've popped it into one toolkit, then it's relatively easy to do the same job again. But I mean, are there significant differences that farmers will find between using your toolkit and using another one if they've already used another one?
In some areas they may. I mean, certainly within one of the projects that all 3 calculators are jointly working on, we do have some time within that project to create a mechanism for translating data from one calculator to another. So it's
Right.
certainly the ambition that it will be possible for farmers using any of our 3 calculators to be able to request to move their data into one of the other 2 calculators over time.
Right.
That's not going to be immediately available, but it's certainly on our list, because I'm only too aware of farmers, who they might sell beef to one business that requires them to use Agricult. They might sell something else to somebody else requiring them to use a different calculator over time. And as a farmer, I can fully understand how frustrating that's going to be. And I think that's probably behind farmers wanting, to see the closest possible harmonization. But I think the ability to move data from one calculator to another is probably going to be answering that question as well as it can be answered.
Yeah, but I mean, I guess one of the main reasons that farmers are doing these calculators is to look at how they can improve their system, how they can make changes. I mean, that's the whole point, and that's why many of their customers are asking them to do the toolkits as well. But just sort of thinking about that, where are the biggest gains? Where can they make their biggest improvements in your experience, Liz?
Okay, and I think that's absolutely the right question to ask, because at the heart of all of this, and for all of us, we've got to see what we can do, not only to store more carbon in soils, trees and hedges, but also what could we do to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from our farm businesses. And there are sort of some fairly chunky ways, really. So for arable farming, the area that's going to have the most impact on your business emissions are reducing nitrogenous fertilizer, without a shadow of a doubt. And we've recently done some work modeling the impact of adopting regenerative farming practices on the emissions of arable farming. And really, that is the only way to reduce emissions at a significant level, I would say, is to be able to reduce reliance on artificial nitrogen fertilizers. And that typically is going to mean something that's right at the heart of the NCS project, which is about bringing pulses and legumes into arable farming rotations for all sorts of reasons. Not only will it reduce reliance on artificial fertilizers, but it should also improve soil health, and if done well, will support wildlife biodiversity on farms. So so for arable farming, that's the critical one.
Yeah.
When it comes to livestock farming, it's about reducing reliance on supplementary feeds, and specifically on imported protein within those supplementary feeds. So again, it's back to substituting soya with things like peas, beans, rape. And it's also about maximising utilisation and quality of forage that's provided for those livestock and minimising reliance on other feedstuffs. Those are the sort of two really big areas. And then you're into areas which I call good housekeeping. So it's where you can going on to sustainable energy electricity tariffs if you can't put your own solar panels up. It's about making sure all your machinery is properly calibrated. It's about buying machinery which utilizes or requires less energy wherever possible. It's all of those things, and they do add up. And certainly we're probably one of the few organizations now that has been doing this kind of work for quite a while. So we're now in the great situation that we're going back round farm businesses that we baselined 3 years ago and have provided advice to on all these kind of areas, and are now remeasuring their footprint. And
Right.
we will be doing some case studies just really to encourage others, because we've seen very reliably 10 to 20% reduction in emissions through adopting these practices, which
Right.
is encouraging. I mean, because I think the thing that probably we all need to think of is, as food producers, there is a level of emissions that are inevitable and inevitably associated with producing that food, which is why all of us as farmers need to be able to develop our own mechanisms for insetting or providing our own offsets, if you like, for our own emissions.
Yeah. Well, that's interesting, and I was going to move on in a bit and ask you, from a policy point of view, to address that. But just before we do, it's interesting that you say that, of course, you've got a really long history, as in the Farm Carbon Toolkit has, in doing the measuring people's emissions, and you've got people coming back to you now, doing their repeat thing, so they can see where the changes are. So. Just looking at those changes, which are the ones that where people are making the really big wins, and which are the ones that but perhaps when they went into it in the first place, they didn't realize they would make such big wins, the surprise wins. Which are the ones that are coming out there?
I would say, if you're looking at the livestock sector,
Yeah,
it's about really rethinking your production systems to reduce your reliance on supplementary feeds. So it's looking at actually thinking, well, if I, for instance, introduction of herbal lays, introduction of different grazing practices, and they can have, honestly, phenomenal impacts. And in fact, I won't sort of give out a spoiler alert, but on Thursday we've got the second year of our Carbon Farmer of the Year awards, and we had within our finalists 4 dairy farmers, which you might think they're going to find it the hardest to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions, simply because as managers of ruminants there's going to be quite a lot of methane. But these dairy farmers are making massive changes that are making significant reductions in their emissions, as well as building soil carbon.
Well, that's interesting, because I speak to a lot of farmers and livestock producers who say, look, I get that soya is a big, in terms of emissions and so on. But look, I've moved to sustainable sources. I can't cut it out of my diet altogether, because it's going to impact my productivity. What would you say to those farmers then, Liz?
I mean, I guess they're dairy farmers. They're either dairy farmers or they're monogastric farmers, if they're saying that. I think for ruminant livestock farmers, there's definitely the potential for taking soya out of the diet. I appreciate, though, that if they're sitting at around 13,000 litres, they may be less, what's the right word, adventurous in pursuing that. But I guess then, and it is, I appreciate just how challenging it is. When I've started my career with ADAS, I did spend 5 years as a dairy advisor. And, I think the push to increase yields has been huge over the last 15, 20 years. But having said that, there's lots of challenges that come with that, not least that, what do we do with bull calves that probably haven't been bred to produce beef? Whereas, so it may well be that over time, and I stress the word over time, because making big changes quickly can be quite difficult because of all the investment that's been put into play to pursue a particular system of production. And I think that's possibly where we're at a little bit with some of the dairy systems we have in the UK. And certainly I think when you look at some of the farmers who we've been visiting as part of the Carbon Farmer of the Year, that they're starting to turn some of that on its head. And I think that's really fascinating.
Oh, well, that's really interesting to hear. And hopefully we'll see more of that over the coming months and years, Liz. But I just wanted to ask about, the policy objectives here. And, obviously DEFRA have a mission to help farmers reduce their carbon footprint. It's a government objective that, nationally we've got to be net zero by 2050. We set a target within farming that we're going to do it with before 2040, and DEFRA is there to support us through that. So, what advice have you got for them in helping our farmers?
Okay, I mean, I think it's a big brief for DEFRA to really get to grips with this. And I think probably my first advice would be for them to listen to lots of different people to get a really good grip of their brief. That would be the first one. And I get the sense that both Steve Reed and Daniel Zeichner are doing just that. I also understand that they've just recruited or appointed the EFRA committee chair, who actually comes from Orkney, which I think is, I don't think you could wish to see a more pragmatic set of farmers than the farmers who farm on Orkney. So I'm hoping some of that will have rubbed off on him. So I think, having reflected a little bit, the first thing I would say as advice to them, and it's starting to happen a little bit through the DEFRA Future Farming Resilience Programme, is that some of the advisors who deliver that programme are offering baseline carbon footprints to their clients. But I do think that DEFRA should go further now and really think about how they can support all farmers to do that baselining. That will be the first thing. And then I think the second thing they should do in this space, there's lots of other things they should do, but specifically in this space to do with helping farmers to understand their role in both producing emissions and also what they can do to reduce their own business emissions, as well as supporting carbon removals, is to better support advice. Up until now, there has been absolutely no advice support scheme supporting farmers specifically in this area. And in fact, quite often Farm Carbon Toolkit, we felt a little bit like a lone voice in this space. We developed our toolkit as an online tool for farmers who want to know how can we reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. And we're probably the only organisation that's got such a toolkit, and we stand very much ready both to improve that toolkit and also to support other groups of advisors to be able to really go out there and help farmers, because there's certainly, from our experience, it's one thing to do a carbon footprint and give a farmer a number, but then what do they do with that number? I think then is the time for hand-holding, for somebody to help them understand what it means, and then to understand what the potential options are for making changes, because obviously no farmer wants to make changes to reduce emissions if it means they're going to be worse off. So clearly we have to find those win-win strategies for them.
Well, I'm glad you said that, Liz, because that leads me to the my last question on this, which was around carbon markets. And of course, that's potentially the advantage here, that if you've measured your carbon footprint, and especially if you've got carbon to spare, carbon sequestration to spare, you can potentially sell it on the open market. And there is now a price for carbon that you can get on the open market. Many farmers have done so. What is your advice as far as that's concerned?
Okay, so I'd say a slightly different things you're saying, really. So the first thing, I mean, as a farm business, you can reduce your emissions and it can be profitable. So you can actually set about an emissions reduction strategy and end up better off simply through changing farming practice, which reduces reliance on expensive inputs. So that's one way of doing it without recourse to any type of voluntary market, whether it be for carbon, biodiversity, net gain, whatever. Then, I mean, certainly you are, though, right that I think over time, as these markets mature and are actually able to properly support farmers, we will see more and more farmers entering these markets. It is, I would say at the moment, it is difficult. And for me, this is where the biggest area for us all needing to really improve our knowledge sits, because certainly as a farm business, if all businesses are going to be required to get to net zero, some of those carbon removals that farms are capable of doing can be used to offset their own emissions and probably need to be used for that purpose first. Then I think the next thing I'd say on that is we all talk about reaching net zero as if it's a point at which then point we stay there, but we don't. So I mean, and so for instance, in any particular year, and you'd be the same as me, Tom, you might have a certain amount of business emissions and a certain amount of sequestration depending on your trees, your hedges, your soils, and that might in some years get you or me to net zero. So in other words, our sequestration balances our emissions, and we might say, whoop-de-doo, we've got to net zero. The following year, probably our emissions will be, unless we change farming practice, will be there or thereabouts the same. But we can't count last year's sequestration against this year's emissions.
Right.
We have to sequester the same amount on top of last year's sequestration if we are going to say we are still at net zero. And I'm not sure that is well understood yet.
Well, that's fascinating. I have to say, Liz, this is all we've got time for in this episode.
That's a great point to end then. Yeah,
which leaves it on a bit of a cliffhanger.
It does indeed, doesn't it?
Well, I hope that means that our listeners will join us as we carry on this conversation in part 2. And just to let everyone know, there are CPD points available for listening to the Boffin Buzz and for this episode. And the details of those CPD points will be coming up on the screen. And if you're listening on the podcast through your usual podcast supplier, we will insert it in around somewhere in around this part of the podcast.
Hello, I interrupt the podcast to let you know the first part of the code for your CPD point. So it's E//139953. This will be on the screen as well, but just to repeat, it's E//139953. Perfect. So you'll get the second part of that code in the second part of the episode. And let's continue.
But look, Liz, thank you so much for joining us and having that fascinating discussion about carbon and everything to do with it and the Farm Carbon Toolkit, leaving it on a little bit of a cliffhanger there, and absolutely every reason to do so, because we're going to be coming back talking about carbon and in particular the NCS project and what we're doing with the NCS project at the next episode of the Boffin Buzz. So thank you very much, Liz. And thank you very much to everyone for listening, and goodbye.